And bad morning, everybody. This is the 12th of September, 2018, and welcome to Bad Morning News, brought to you by Brave Browser, the ad-resistant, tracker-resistant browser. Now, today's episode is going to be a little bit focused on particularly things that we did discuss a little bit yesterday. Um, and also a couple of new events. However, the big news here in Europe today is related to one of the last articles that we covered yesterday, Article 13. Well, turns out, yep, they got it to pass, proving that the EU system is just as corrupt as we all believed it to be. Let me pull up the article from The Independent that I found on this. Note, this may actually mean as well that I am going to struggle to actually do this in future, simply because I could wind up dragging everybody else in and creating a huge bundle of liability in the very near future. So that's something we're going to have to manage here. But from The Independent, EU Parliament approves new copyright rules that could be catastrophic for the internet. This is by an Andrew Griffin, and it was only published 2 hours ago. The EU Parliament has approved new copyright rules that campaigners have warned could be catastrophic for the internet. MEPs voted for the controversial rules known as Article 11 and 13. The most criticized of those is the latter, which stipulates that technology platforms must filter the things people post on them and check for copyright infringement. Campaigners warn that would probably force internet companies to introduce stringent new automated checks that content must pass before they are posted to platforms like Twitter and Facebook. That could reject anything that even possibly infringe copyright, leading to potentially banning memes that use screen grabs from films, for instance, according to campaigners. Julia Reda, a Pirate Party MEP who has actively campaigned against the new measures, said they would be catastrophic, saying that the upload filters would mean that legitimate content will be removed from sites accidentally. Anything you want to publish will need to first be approved by these filters. Perfectly legal content like parodies and memes will be caught in the crosshairs. Article 11 also introduces a so-called link tax. That will mean companies like Google and Facebook could have to pay news organizations to use the headlines on their sites, for instance, which campaigners claim could undermine some of the most central technologies of the internet. Today, MEPs have decided to support the filtering of the internet to the benefit of big businesses in the music and publishing industries, despite huge public outcry, said Saida Ramli, director of EDIMA, the trade association representing online platforms. We hope that governments of the EU will hear their citizens' concerns in the next stage of negotiations. All the rules have received sustained criticism from both the big technology platforms as well as internet campaigners, but they have been supported by the big companies in the media industries as well as some of the biggest stars, including musicians like Paul McCartney. But some musicians argue the rules could actually hurt their industry by stifling the ability to collaborate. Musicians and artists thrive when they collaborate and share, said Wyclef Jean, who is in Strasbourg arguing against the rules. I've worked with so many young artists, the future, who have sampled my music and succeeded. Upload filters or anything else that restricts this will stop artists from making and creating the future. There's more to this article, but to be fair, I mean, that is the gist of it. And yeah, EU's screwed the internet, boys and girls. It's time to start defending your memes. It's about all I can say on this one. I have no idea how the UK is actually going to take this on its own. I have a suspicion that we will hopefully throw this particular set of rulings away when Brexit gets signed. I can't say for certain. Right now, as far as I'm aware, this technically applies to the UK as well. So, any of the listeners out there who are from Britain, I'm sorry, we didn't quite get enough people behind us. But let's be fair, it wouldn't have mattered because the EU is not democratic. Anyway, Cryptic, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's just a bummer to hear that it's going forward at this point. I mean, I can only hope that once people see the reality of the unintended consequences of this, that they'll, hopefully wake up and do something. Because yeah, this is just really ridiculous, and it's sad. As you mentioned, it could potentially keep you from being able to participate in something just like this show, and yeah, that's just a bummer. So, thanks for uh, keeping us filled up to date and filled in on that.
Yeah,
And
it's bad, and to be quite frank, I have no idea if this means I'll be able to continue doing this. It really is. The law is also incredibly vague, so, and that's part of the reason why there were 252 amendments, which, by the way, were all rejected, every single one of them, including some really basic, sensible things. And obviously, one to just scrap this completely because it's totally not fit for purpose, which is the case.
yeah, yeah,
It's bad, and well, that's what we report here is bad news. The other thing is that in amongst all of these laws was Article, I think it was 3, which basically made data mining only legal if you were a research company. Now, for those of you who don't know, data mining is pretty much anything that utilizes large amounts of data to discover insights. And a lot of companies don't classify themselves as research companies, and research implies scientific research. Uh, the research that most companies do is how the hell to sell you something efficiently. And all of that will potentially be made illegal, which could invalidate an entire industry. And the response to that will be from that industry to just ignore the EU's existence and pretend it's not there and just not service it at all in any way. So if you are an EU citizen, if you're reliant on somebody selling your product in the EU, you should be complaining about this in the strongest possible terms to everybody you know. Just and if nothing else, you should point and laugh at Brussels for being so epically moronic. But hey, can't be helped. Not at this point. Hopefully, the individual countries will come together and actually realize what the hell is going on. I'm not banking on that either. The music industry is very powerful, and the lobbies are quite influential. So wait and see is about the best we can do. But this is coming, people. Start protecting your memes. Anyway, why don't you? I think we've got some fairly high-end news coming in from the East Coast of America. So why don't you cover that, Cryptic?
all right. Yeah, this is from Activist Post, and it's regarding Hurricane Florence. Hurricane Florence to intensify to near Category 5 strength, and there are 12 nuclear power reactors in the Carolinas. This article is written by Michael Snyder from Activist Post. The latest forecast is projecting that Hurricane Florence will strengthen to near Category 5 strength before it makes landfall in the Carolinas, and it is being called a serious threat to lives and property. It is extremely rare for a hurricane of this intensity to come this far north, and one expert is claiming that Florence has the potential to be the most destructive hurricane we've had in modern history for this region. At this time, the government is warning of a life threatening storm surge of up to 20 feet or higher, life threatening freshwater flooding, and damaging hurricane force winds. But there is another factor that not a lot of people are talking about. There are 12 nuclear power reactors in the Carolinas, including two that are located right along the coast. According to Google, there are 7 nuclear power reactors in South Carolina. South Carolina hosts 7 operating nuclear power reactors: Catawba Units 1 and 2, Oconee Units 1, 2, and 3, HB, and there are 5 nuclear power reactors in North Carolina: Brunswick Units 1 and 2, McGuire Units 1 and 2, and Sheeran Harris Unit 1. These account for nearly 32% of electricity generation in the state. It is the 2 reactors at the Brunswick plant that are the most of concern because they sit right along the coast and they are directly in the projected path of the storm. Following is what Wikipedia has to say about those reactors. The Brunswick Nuclear Power Plant, named for Brunswick County, North Carolina, covers 1,200 acres. The site is adjacent to the town of Southport, North Carolina, and to wetlands and woodlands, and was opened in 1975. The site contains 2 General Electric boiling water reactors, which are cooled by water collected from the Cape Fear River and discharged into the Atlantic Ocean. In a worst-case scenario, could we potentially be facing America's version of Fukushima? Hurricane Florence greatly intensified on Monday. This is an excerpt from the very latest NOAA forecast. Number 1, a life-threatening storm surge is likely along portions of the coastlines of South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, and a storm surge watch will likely be issued for some of these areas by Tuesday morning. All interests from South Carolina into the mid-Atlantic region should ensure they have their hurricane plan in place. Number 2, life-threatening freshwater flooding is likely from a prolonged and exceptionally heavy rainfall event, which may extend inland over the Carolinas and the mid-Atlantic for hundreds of miles, as Florence is expected to slow down as it approaches the coast and moves inland. 3, damaging hurricane-force winds are likely along the portions of the coasts of South and North Carolina, and a hurricane watch will likely be issued by Tuesday morning. Damaging winds could also spread well inland into portions of the Carolinas and Virginia. And according to the National Hurricane Center in Miami, there is definitely a possibility that Hurricane Florence could still strengthen into a Category 5 storm. Experts weren't ready to rule out the possibility that Florence could even make landfall as a Category 5 hurricane, a feat never achieved by any recorded storm in the region. Dennis Feltgen, a spokesperson for the National Hurricane Center, says that reaching Category 5 is certainly a possibility. If Florence doesn't undergo a phenomenon known as an eye wall replacement cycle, which would weaken the storm, it has a chance of reaching the 175-mile-per-hour boundary and making history, Feltgen says. It is very rare for a storm of this magnitude to make landfall this far north. Landfalling Category 4 hurricanes are rare in the mainland U.S., with just 24 such landfalls since 1851, an average of 1 every 7 years. All but 3 of these 27 landfalls by Cat 4s and 5s have occurred south of South Carolina's latitude. Thus, Florence will be in very select company if it manages to make landfall at Category 4 strength in North or South Carolina. And so it just goes on to talk about the history of hurricanes in the region, and I think there was another hurricane that hit that area a few years ago. I don't think it wasn't quite Cat 4 or 5, I don't think, but it's definitely something to be concerned about, and it's always a concern of coasts here and of course other places around the world that get these storms, and it can be really devastating, but hopefully anyone in its path will have taken proper preparation protocols into consideration, and it definitely will keep you any of you in my thoughts if you are in the path of this hurricane. And I used to live in the Southern Virginia area, and I know there's actually the largest naval base in the world. The U.S. Naval base is there
In
as well.
Norfolk.
So yeah, and so I wonder. It hasn't. Yeah, this article didn't even mention that. It didn't mention all the nuclear aircraft carriers and submarines that are
Hmm.
are there as well. So that's something to watch also.
Yes, that's very true. I did. I didn't take into consideration the Norfolk military base. I mean, a lot of the older ships are there as well, because I think mothballs is where they put ships away, basically dry dock or to retire them, and decommission them. And I think there is a very large section there dedicated to that. So yeah, watch this space. This could get a lot worse if they're not careful. I'm relatively confident of the Navy to manage its own equipment, but only up to a point, just like every other form of the military. They will likely drop the ball in certain crisis situations, especially if they think, oh, it probably won't affect us. They haven't said anything about it affecting us. And but at the same time, Norfolk is a very big uh, issue to deal with. And another big issue to deal with is power, because a lot of America's power infrastructure is overhead power lines. Some areas have underground, but there's still a fair amount delivered overground. A lot of that will come down during this, and you will get major power outages at the moment. Um, so, and from someone in the area, Danielle Hatfield, they are saying that high winds in the area are not so much of a threat, but what can they really know for now? And that's a very valid point. They can only use historical data to make any kind of assessment of this. And if this particular event changes history, as it were, then throw that data out the window. You have no idea what it's going to do. And the best thing you can do is just prepare for the worst case scenario. Batten down the hatches, board up the windows if you have to, and make sure that anything that you think may not fly away in a high wind is still secured to the ground. Otherwise, it will fly away in a high wind.
Yeah, definitely don't rely on any kind of government response after the fact because we've already seen that happen many times, even just in recent memory here in the U.S. So don't rely on FEMA because your welfare is not their top priority.
Oh yeah, God no! Don't rely on FEMA. Do you remember Katrina? Do you remember the chaos there? I mean, most over here in Britain will know Katrina based on Top Gear because they went there about a year later, and it was still completely broken from the event. So these kinds of now, granted, they also had severe flooding, a lot of levees went, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of things that they knew could go wrong did go wrong, and they didn't listen. And it's unfortunate, but they were told years ago that this kind of event was inevitable. It's not a matter of if, but when, and they didn't work on the infrastructure, and that's why Katrina did as much damage as it did. I'm not confident the locations that are going to be hit necessarily have the infrastructure. Some areas of Virginia, particularly farther north, will probably suffer much less damage compared to North Carolina, but North Carolina is where all those nuclear power plants are. So, yeah, could get very messy very quickly if it does turn into a Category 5.
Yeah, yeah, and
But
I think there are even more nuclear submarine bases on the coast of North Carolina in addition to Norfolk. So
mm,
yeah, it's just an ugly situation. So,
Yeah, that's one thing about people is, and Crash Course did well to cover this as well. I do recommend their history programs. Um, Humanity basically thrives on the coast largely because of fishing. And we sort of all migrated to coastal areas and then just kind of stayed there despite the inherent danger, flooding, serious storms, all sorts of stuff. It can be quite problematic on coastlines and particularly on islands, because you can't get off them so easily when something big hits. Thankfully, the last hurricane I think that had any real impact on Britain was, oh, good Lord, back in the 80s. And that was also an epic fail where they said it was going to be blue skies, and the next day, hurricane. So yeah, Michael Fish, for anybody who's interested, was responsible for that one, and he became a bit of a meme in his own right during the day, even though there wasn't an internet. Why don't you cover the one for sanctions now? Because I've got a good tie-in for that with what Russia and China are up to.
all right, sanctions. Let me just find that article. All right. This is out of antiwar.com. Trump will sanction anyone who the intel communities say meddled in U.S. elections. According to reports, President Trump intends to sign an executive order later this week, which will order sanctions on all foreign companies or individuals who are judged by the intelligence community to have interfered in the U.S. midterm elections. Indications are that this doesn't actually include anybody as of yet. Rather, it is intended to be a preemptive announcement of the planned U.S. retaliation for any cyber attacks or other interference in the November vote. The order will empower the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the CIA, the NSA, and the Department of Homeland Security to make decisions on if election meddling happened. Interference is going to be very broadly defined, including not just attacks on election infrastructure, but also things like attempts to sway public opinion or
Oh
leaking
God.
political information, which might have an effect on voters' decisions. Exactly how much evidence will be needed isn't clear, which is likely to be a big problem with this new order. U.S. officials have been eager to blame politically convenient targets for meddling in the past without concrete proof, and the intelligence community has historically seemed eager to sign off on those claims. That's written by Jason Ditz of antiwar.com.
Did they define what meddling means?
Apparently not.
Oh, goody. So you're meddling. Do you have a license for that, mate? It could wind up becoming an issue now in the States, particularly around election time or anything to do with election coverage. Boy, oh dear. I could definitely see this getting misused big time against some very big internet names as well. I mean, you could make the claim that people like Paul Joseph Watson or Sargon of Akkad or Count Dankula or V or any of that crowd, even Medica, could, if he ever covered anything political, could fall into that particular trap. I think that's particularly why he doesn't do it, is because he knows that it's A, too much of a fucking headache, and B, could land him into some serious shit with some powerful people. Whereas poking fun of morons on the internet is far more profitable for him. And to be quite frank, I think it's far more fun too. I can understand that raison d'etre, but I don't get why Trump is going down this road at the moment beyond, well, I've got the power, so let's use it. However, I do think it's interesting that both the CIA and the NSA are going to have responsibilities and the DHS, all the different intel departments are going to have some sort of responsibility to determine what's meddling and what isn't. So, what if the ones who are, and I'm sure there are a few, pro Trump, decide that the meddlers within one of the other organizations is an active threat to the election. It seems to cover foreign nationals very well, but it doesn't seem to cover anything when it comes to U.S. Local, shall we say, internal interference with the election.
Yeah, that was my question. When are they going to censure all these different three-letter agencies for trying to sway public opinion with their fear mongering
Yeah,
endlessly?
exactly. Or hack the vote. I mean, there was that accusation from Georgia that DHS actively tried to hack their election system.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And that was during the 2016 election. And recently, we covered an article, if I'm not mistaken, on how same state basically was complaining about their voter machines flipping the votes. They didn't say which way they flipped, but they did say that they were changing the person who is being voted for as part of the vote. Sort of like one of those moving button things that you used to find as a game where you could never quite push the button. It's that kind of principle. It's like I want to select this candidate. No, not that one. This one. Yeah, and I can understand their frustration because that kind of technology can be deliberately designed to fuck things up or manipulate the results. So again, how are that's more likely to occur. So how are these intel communities going to stop that, or are they actively doing it? It begs the question.
Yeah, I think ultimately it will just be come down to being another partisan issue where whoever feels they lost the midterm election will claim there's some bad actor interfering or swaying opinions. Apparently, that counts as meddling now. But
Hmm. Like it's getting to the point where again, I have to ask: is this Poe's law? I'm really beginning to wonder what is and is not real anymore sometimes. But hey, this is the world we live in. Every day is a new bundle of madness that we get to play with, unpackage, and try and interpret in some sort of sensible way. And I think this ties in well with all of that because it's kind of showing that the people that have been lambasted by the West the most frequently are getting a bit tired of it and they are showing their force. Putin, this is from the Daily Mail yesterday. Uh, Putin's show of strength. Russia begins war games by parading nuclear capable missiles that reach London and mobilizing 300,000 troops and 36,000 tanks alongside Chinese forces in rehearsals for a large conflict. So they basically did a war games presentation, uh, which, to be fair, is something America does on a very regular basis. Um, but these are going to last for 1 week. They've been dubbed Vostok 2018, which is East 2018 in Russia. They kicked off in far eastern Russia on Tuesday. The defense ministry released videos of vehicles, planes, helicopters, and ships getting into position. The massive drills, which include Chinese and Mongolian armies, have been condemned by NATO, of course. They coincide with talks between Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping at an economic forum. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has paraded nuclear capable missiles that are able to reach London in rehearsals for a large conflict along Chinese soldiers. Beijing issued a veiled threat to US President Donald Trump as it launched its largest ever military drills, with 300,000 Russian troops taking part, along with Chinese soldiers, in a massive show of force that has rattled the West. The week-long war games, dubbed Vostok 2018, have kicked off in far eastern Russia and on the Pacific Ocean, the Russian Defense Ministry said in a statement. There's a very large infographic as well associated with this article that I do recommend people read. It gives you sort of a light detail as to the entire theater that's being played here. The ministry has said this activity was part of the first stage of the exercise, which runs until September 17th, and it involved deploying additional forces to Russia's Far East and naval buildup involving its northern Pacific fleets. The main aim was to check the military readiness to move troops large distances, to test how close infantry and naval forces cooperated, and to perfect command and control procedures. Later stages would involve rehearsals of both defensive and offensive scenarios. The Defense Ministry said that the largest military drill since the end of the Cold War will involve about 36,000 tanks and 300,000 troops at sea and on the ground. China is sending 3,200 troops to take part in the exercises later this week. And they coincide with economic talks between Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of an economic forum in Vladivostok in Russia's Far East on Tuesday. There's quite a lot of photographic and video footage as well associated with this. So if you like looking at large planes and bombs and things, this may be just for you to see what the other guy has. Skipping ahead a little bit, Xi, whose country is locked in an escalating trade showdown with the United States, did not mention Washington, but said an increasingly unpredictable geopolitical climate had made partnership between Russia and China even more important. The war games are being held a year after Russia staged major drills in the country's west, unnerving neighboring former Soviet republics. Meanwhile, NATO and European governments have been eyeing the exercises closely, watching to see what they reveal about military cooperation between Russia and China and their mounting military might. The drills have been condemned by NATO as a rehearsal for large scale conflict by NATO, which has said it will monitor the exercise closely, as will the United States, which has a strong military presence in the Asia Pacific region. Again, lots more photos and a bit more to this article as well, but I think that summarizes it fairly well. Yeah, Russia's not just sitting down at the moment. So this could get interesting very, very quickly. Thoughts?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not a surprise that Russia and China would be kind of nudged together by NATO, constant harassment of them and running their own drills right on Russia's border. So, I mean, I just think of that meme that shows a map and shows the locations of all the hundreds of U.S. bases all around Eastern Europe and such, and says, uh, of course, Russia wants war. Look how close they put their country to our bases. It's of course this will be spun in the U.S. mainstream media as a reason to see Russia as an aggressor as well as China, but of course, most Americans don't have the depth to understand that it's always been NATO as the aggressor and encircling them and not really leaving them much choice. I mean, it just doesn't surprise me uh, that countries that feel trapped are trying to hold on to whatever military might they have.
Mm, well, it could be. I mean, there's one problem with staging a major war game. You can reveal a lot about what you are capable of in the process. Whether or not you do is another story, but it's there's other things at play here as well, from my perspective. I mean, if you remember, there were a couple of unusual false alerts to our ballistic missile system, and missiles apparently had been shot down in a couple of instances as well, uh, according to chatter. And this kind of thing could be a deliberate response to that as well. There's no way of knowing one way or the other. If Put it this way, if there are elements of our government which are not working in lockstep with the rest of the state, there is a very good chance that they are running rogue. If they're rogue, then any nation is going to consider them a threat, not just America, because they will be the ones who are just as likely targeted, because false flags are very useful tools at making things appear problematic. And they could just be running this drill to show their preparedness on all sides. The Western Front was more, I think, geared towards Crimea when it happened, because the whole point of that exercise was to show that no, you can't just come over and take back that bit of land we took, because we will protect it. And this is the kind of force we have to do so. And let's not forget what happened in Syria, the reports that came out of there as well, with, oh, what was it? About 70% of missiles, I think. Chat, feel free to correct me if you know the figure better than I do. The yeah, if 70% of the missiles that were fired by a naval ship and whatnot were ineffective for whatever reason, it either means that America's strategical advantage of photographic intelligence is far overstated, or our systems are not as advanced as their anti-ballistic missile systems. So there is a good chance weapons could be easily shot down if it ever did come down to a problem, a serious one, such as a war. Uh, and personally, I doubt it will come to that anytime soon, because most people's appetite for war is quite low in the West, even if their leaders are chomping at the bit, because they know if they don't do something soon, they're going to have an absolute economic shit show on their hands. Um, but beside that, I don't see it happening unless somebody pushes a button and says, fuck the lot of you. And at this point, most of the world won't care if the EU is the one who decides to implode and start going to war with each other. They'll only care if it spreads further. Because, as everybody in chat at the moment is saying, fuck the EU. And to be quite frank, I agree. Its people could be quite lovely, and I've met many of them, and they're absolute salts of the earth, usually. But their governments are fucking retarded, and their federal government even more so. It's not democratic, it's nightmarish. But I don't see, at this point, I don't see NATO running gung ho for a battle it's probably going to really struggle to win, and will very easily lose because it keeps on hyping up what it has. And I know the costs of what those things are. Unless they can guarantee none of their new planes, for example, get shot down, there's very little chance people are going to want to go for war here in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think a lot of it ends up at the end of the day just being theater for the purpose of fundraising for the military industrial complex,
Hmm,
kind of the new Cold War type thing.
does indeed. Why don't you hit up that article on the Catholic Church, mate? It seems quite recent. And it looks like a follow-up as well to a previous story that we... Yes, I believe it is. A follow-up to a previous story that we at least tangentially covered.
Yeah, this is from the Free Thought Project, written by Matt Agrist. Grand jury finds police were complicit in covering up massive child sex ring in Catholic Church. Pennsylvania grand jury has found that police and district attorneys were complicit in covering up the rampant child sex abuse in the Catholic Church. For those who have been keeping up with the child sex abuse scandal in the Catholic Church that erupted late last month in Pennsylvania, many have been wondering how it was allowed to go on for so long without anyone getting charged or arrested. Now we may have the answer. The police were complicit. during a grand jury report into the child sex abuse by priests in Pennsylvania. The state attorney general, Josh Shapiro, provided insight into how priests were allowed to go on for decades preying on children. He singled out the two groups responsible for covering up the crimes of the church. One of the groups named by the AG was the Catholic Church hierarchy, like the archbishops and cardinals, who reacted to allegations of child rape by simply transferring the priest to a new church or failing to act at all. The other group Shapiro named was law enforcement, who he says acted in tandem with the abusive priests to keep their horrific habits from ever reaching the public eye. The abuse scarred every diocese, he said. The cover up was sophisticated. The church protected the institution at all costs. Not only did the church protect pedophile priests, but the investigation revealed a failure of law enforcement. According to Shapiro, according to the investigation, at the same time the church was covering up the abuse by protecting the pedophiles, it also had assistance from police or DAs who aided in covering it up as well. Sometimes this aid was in the form of looking the other way, while other times it involved actively thwarting investigations. As the Morning Call reports, the documented cases of lax enforcement occurred decades ago, but by allowing offending priests to walk freely, law enforcement cleared a path for more abuse to occur and left victims without justice. It's impossible to say how many children were molested by priests who avoided charges, but the grand jury report found that some accused priests, aided by see no evil law enforcement, were able to live freely for decades, and that the 1,000 victims the grand jury counted likely were the tip of the iceberg. For former Philadelphia District Attorney Lynn Abram, the problem often started at police departments, which were stocked with Catholic police officers. They knew the priests, but more importantly, she said, the priests knew them. It was a different time, she said. You didn't remonstrate with the guy who's giving you absolution. Northampton County District Attorney John Morganelli told the Morning Call that he experienced this shunning by law enforcement and the church firsthand when he prosecuted Monsignor Stephen T. Forish for allegedly soliciting sex from a man one morning in 1996. Forish would later be acquitted, only to be charged again for a similar crime years later. He would die awaiting trial in that case. According to the Morning Call, Shapiro refused to go into detail on how exactly law enforcement helped to cover up the abuse. However, they pointed out one glaring public example. One of the most egregious missed opportunities by law enforcement involved the Reverend Thomas Bender, who was serving at St. Francis Orphanage in Orwigsburg in 1972. That year, the grand jury report said a state trooper found Bender with a high school-aged boy, both with no pants on, in a car. The case was reported by another trooper, who was also a deacon in the church, the grand jury report said. A report by Monsignor Anthony Montone to Bishop Thomas J. Welsh, then head of the Allentown Diocese, stated that the first trooper gave Bender a lecture and sent him on his way. One district attorney was even caught on record deliberately blocking investigations into the rape of young boys by priests in 1964. Beaver County District Attorney Robert Masters was presented with evidence that a Catholic priest was raping several young boys. However, he blocked the investigation to prevent unfavorable publicity. I have, in order to prevent unfavorable publicity, halted all investigations into similar incidents with other young boys, Masters wrote in an August 4, 1964 letter to Pittsburgh Diocese Bishop Vincent Leonard. As the Free Thought Project has previously pointed out, pedophilia among the elite is rampant in instance after horrifying instance. The Free Thought Project continues to push these issues to the forefront in spite of the mainstream media claiming that talk of elite pedophilia is akin to tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theory. And so that's an update on a story that was making the rounds a couple weeks ago. And unfortunately, it's not a surprise at all that the police deliberately or indeliberately, just looked the other way and didn't seem to care about these kids. And that's how things like this go on for years and decades.
Unfortunately, that is the case, and Jesus, it's well over 50 years worth of abuse that was going on there. And I mean, it's atrocious that the cops who are paid by you, the taxpayer, ladies and gentlemen, to protect you, were deliberately protecting those who were harming your children. And that hopefully will be a bit of a wake up call for some people, at least in Pennsylvania, to actively do something about this. And the fact is, as Matt highlights at the end of the article, it does seem to be showing a bit of a shift. We are seeing people moving against pedophilia in quite strong numbers. Now, as Jeremiah would say, it could just be the fall guys that are going down. And yeah, it could be. But I'm hopeful that it's more than that. And I'm hopeful it's not just going to be a few well placed pieces of bait, as it were, being used to silence the people into thinking that this issue is resolved. It won't be resolved until the problem is stemmed, and it can't be with the current system in place. I'm sorry, but it just won't work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is similar stories have come out many times, even over my lifetime. I've heard a lot of these types of stories come out, and people, claim they're so surprised. And unfortunately, I'm never surprised to hear that story like that, just knowing the power structure within the church and knowing their influence over people. And unfortunately, a lot of people within who are, devout Catholics end up feeling like they can't speak out even if they do see something. And just unfortunately, all that just factors into how these things go on for so long. And hopefully, yeah, I just think it's an issue of people kind of cowing to authority in that sense. And on the one hand, I kind of see why people are skittish about standing up to their religious leaders and stuff like that. But if people want things like this to stop, they need to really have the courage to stand up and say things at the end of the day.
True. And if you're fighting abject evil, like that type of thing, which I do consider it to be, I don't think there's really any other word that describes it better. You've got to consider yourself fighting for whatever God you might be believing in at that time. I know that there's some sects and faiths that treat it as something to be lauded or permissible or whatever. Get with the times. It's no longer the third century, and you need to move on from the periods when you got married when you were still a teenager. It's not like that anymore for damn good reasons. Things have improved thanks to that type of thing. So let's not regress society, and let's move it forward and actually make it something that our children will actually be proud to be a part of rather than have to endure. And as we're coming up to the end of the show, I think we should probably tackle some of these comments. Meteorologists are mostly useless from Fungus 666. Yep, they really are, unfortunately. They very often are wrong on things, and the weather is not so easy to predict as everybody would like to believe. Michael Fish. That's all anybody has to say in Britain to prove that point. Um, also from Fungus, intelligence factions compete with each other in lots of ways. That's very true. They're constantly fighting, as far as I'm aware, to one up each other. In fact, a large chunk of legislation around the Patriot Act was specifically to force all of the various intelligence agencies to work with each other. And I do remember for a good year or two, all of them bitching about it in the media. I have a very clear recollection of it from the time. It was actually quite amusing to watch them squirm so much, complaining about how their methodologies can't be shared and this, that, and the other. And when they were ever pressured on it, they would descend into vagaries and um, issues of security clearance and whatnot. It's like, well, surely these people have the same clearance. Oh, no, no, it's a different type of clearance. And nowadays, they all do have levels of clearance that cover everything. I do find it weird that Q clearance is a concept that, because it's come from the Department of Energy, if my research on the topic is correct, and yet it's also used by military professionals or covers military secrets, which, again, why the Department of Energy? It just seems so random. But there must be something to it. Uh, let's keep through this though. At least social media has been put on notice that they're being watched for bias. It's not much, but yeah, I suppose that was from Danielle. I suppose that's the case, but I mean, I watched bits of the congressional hearing with Twitter, and I'm looking at this thinking that they're getting softballed. They're getting very easy questions to serve, and it's, yes, they're being watched, but they're being watched by people who don't really want to move the board against them in any way. And it's it needs to be more. It's not that it's not much. It is a little, but it needs to be a lot more. Again, from Fungus, Snowden worked for CIA and snitched on the NSA. That's actually a fairly compelling theory because a lot of the CIA intel infrastructure now is largely based on those released documents, which is why Vault 7 was so painful to them. Finian's been a bit busy today coordinating with people who have been in mandatory evac zones, particularly those who've been living on the coast. So, again, our thoughts and our prayers and everything else to those of you who live on the coast of Virginia and North Carolina. I really hope this hurricane does not cause as much trouble as it's looking likely to. But yeah, there's a response to some things, and by people who do not understand algorithms. I'm assuming that's to do with, again, social media. Yeah, again, most people don't get how algorithms work. They're not. They really aren't as smart as people like to think they are. They're really quite dumb. They'll look for keywords or specific phrases. Lyrics, for example, would be a common one. And lyrics fall into common parlance all the time. You can quote a song as a text snippet, and that could wind up getting thrown out as something that is invalid. Or you could share a link from YouTube and make a comment on something, and because it's negative, for example, they could throw some sort of copyright strike on it, or try to at least. You're opening the floodgates. This is literally, most people would complain this is a slippery slope fallacy, but no, this isn't a fallacy. This is real. It's not that this could happen, it's that it will happen. Somebody will try it because they won't understand the law, or the law will allow it, one or the other. I heard it's supposed to be the new storm is supposed to be worse than Superstorm Sandy. It's in a fashion possibly historic, is what I've been hearing. Finian, last I knew, it turned south, which is wait, what? Um, which is good for people in Virginia. Uh, it's a bit odd. Again, J turn does seem like it hit that sort of thing implies it kind of hit some kind of wall almost, an atmosphere of atmospheric pressure. But it just seems a bit unusual that it's changed direction from north to south. Uh, but if it's true, then that's good news, but we'll see. Again, we'll keep a close eye on this over the coming days. Hopefully, nobody there will suffer any major blackouts or anything, and everybody in the area who's watching the show will still be able to keep on top of it. I know we have a few followers in Virginia or in the Virginia area, so good luck to you people. And honestly, just batten down the hatches, keep yourself safe, do everything you can to win proof as much as you can, because that's what's going to be the real killer.
Yeah, at the end of the day, hopefully just stay as safe as you can. And yeah, I really dislike natural disaster type situations. I've never been through a hurricane, but I know it's definitely a stressful time. So I'll definitely keep all of you in my thoughts.
Well, I do remember a few from when I was younger. Nothing serious like Florida one, for example, but always hitting the tail ends of them when I used to live in Virginia. And they can be scary. The winds are quite fierce. Especially around areas which are natural wind tunnels, which you can have some interesting times trying to fall forward in order to move. That's an unusual circumstance, but it does happen in 70-mile-an-hour winds. And the main thing to be aware of at that kind of speed is just debris. Anything can wind up becoming a bit of a missile at that point, and the best option is just seek and keep in shelter and make sure you have plenty of water and plenty of food that you can easily either heat up without needing power, because there is a good risk of loss of power in this sort of situation as well.
Yeah,
But yeah, apparently it's moving more towards South Carolina now, which is very good for people in Virginia. Not so good for Southern North Carolina and South Carolina. So yeah, to you in the Carolinas, good luck with this. Keep yourself safe. And that's about it for today, I think, people. Unfortunately, tomorrow I will not be in attendance. I've got an interview on my side. I'll be trying to get Cryptic, or will be trying to get Cryptic up to speed so he can host the show if need be. And I'm kind of hoping by then as well, Jeremiah will have sorted out some new location to begin these broadcasts from. But yeah, unfortunately, I will not be able to attend. I did what I could, but there was no other time really available to hold this interview. So it is what it is, and I'll be back for the community edition on Friday as normal. And yeah, apart from that, smash the state, fuck the system, and have a bad morning, everybody.
bad morning, guys.